400 planes vanished that morning. The sky over the Pacific cracked open with fire. Men on steel decks watched a storm rise that no one could outrun. Engines shook the dawn like distant thunder rolling across an empty ocean. Every pilot knew he might not see another sunrise. Every commander understood that history was waiting just beyond the horizon. The first orange light touched the waves as if the sea itself was warning them. Task Force 58 braced for a blow that could shatter half the fleet. And high on the deck of the carrier Independence, a single Hellcat waited in silence. Its pilot would soon learn what it meant to fight on the day 400 planes fell into the sea. If you enjoy these stories, I would be honored if you subscribed. And tell me where you are listening from tonight. If it is getting late, I hope you take care of yourself first, because you and I, well, we are not young anymore, and this story will still be here when you need it. The sun climbed slowly behind the clouds as the Pacific stretched out in a wide calm that fooled no one. Below the gentle surface sat a fleet built for one purpose and one purpose only. It was ready to decide who would own the sky. Old carriers rumbled with the steady confidence of veterans who had seen the worst and kept moving. Newer ones buzzed with restless energy as crews loaded belts of ammunition and checked every last panel on the fighters lined up along their decks. Among them stood Lieutenant Commander David Harrington, a man shaped by the first desperate years of the war. He moved with the kind of quiet focus you only see in pilots who have lost friends and lived long enough to carry their stories. The Hellcat he walked toward was painted a deep blue that caught the morning light in a way that made it look heavier than the air around it. He ran his hand along the metal skin like a man greeting an old partner. The fighter felt solid and patient and ready for whatever came next. Around him, the flight deck felt alive. Sailors hustled across the planks with fuel lines and ammunition carts. Officers barked orders through the wind. The smell of salt mixed with the sharp sting of gasoline that always hung over a carrier before a major strike. The rumble of engines vibrated through every bolt and beam until the whole ship felt like a living animal waiting to leap forward. Far to the west, radar screens were already whispering about trouble. Small returns at first, then clusters, then a shape wide enough to turn that calm morning into chaos. Veterans could feel it before anyone said a word. Something big was coming, and every man on the Independence understood that by the end of this day, someone would claim the sky, and someone else would sink into it. Harrington climbed into his cockpit and settled into the seat with the steady movements of a man who had done this so many times that the motions felt like memory itself. He checked his instruments. He listened to the slow growl of the big engine. He breathed the heavy air inside the canopy. The deck shook beneath him as other fighters started to roll forward into position. Up above, the sunrise brightened into a hard gold line across the horizon. It looked peaceful to anyone who didn't know what waited out there. Harrington knew. The men on the deck knew. And soon, the world would know. Because before this long day ended, the sky would decide the fate of a navy, and the Hellcat would carry its pilot straight into the moment when 400 planes vanished forever. Back on that deck with Harrington sitting in his Hellcat, the morning air was thick with expectation. But the story of how he got here didn't start in 1944. It began in the dark days when American fighter pilots felt like they were carrying slingshots into a knife fight. Older men like the narrator would often look at that morning in the Marianas and think back to December 1942 when the world changed in minutes and the Pacific burned with shock and disbelief. The Zero arrived in those skies like a ghost that no one could touch. It slid through turns with frightening grace, It climbed so fast it seemed to bend the rules every pilot thought he understood. And for a long time, no one in an American cockpit had the answer for it. Across those first months of the war, the Zero carved its reputation in fire. At Pearl Harbor, at Wake Island across the Philippines, and later above the Coral Sea. It tore apart American formations with a precision that felt cruel in its efficiency. Pilots would return to their carriers with guns, empty hands shaking and faces pale because they had watched entire flights disappear in seconds. Men who survived those encounters told the same story again and again. They pulled back on the stick, the Zero was already behind them. They dove, the Zero stayed glued to their tail. They tried to turn, the Zero spun around them so quickly that some swore it had to be magic. Harrington came into the war during that grim period when the only fighter he had was the Wildcat. That little machine was tough in its own way, but it was slow heavier than it looked and punished any pilot who tried to fly it like the Zero. Veterans told rookies to never turn with the enemy because doing so was a one-way ticket. So the only tactic left was a desperate dive, a short burst of fire, and a prayer that you lived long enough to reach the clouds again. Harrington watched friends lift off the deck one morning and never return. The sea swallowed many of them. The rest fell burning in the sky with radios full of static and pleas for help that no one could answer. Anyone who thinks the early war was glorious never talked to the men who fought it. But even in the worst days, something else began to grow behind the front lines. Those reports from the Pacific, the messy handwritten notes and hurried sketches from exhausted pilots, they reached engineers in faraway rooms who understood that courage alone could not win this war. They needed something stronger, something that could take hits and keep flying, something a rookie could master without fear. And all those losses, all those desperate dives, all those final words over the radio went straight into the blueprint of a new fighter being shaped by men at Grumman who were determined to give these boys a chance. In late 1943, that machine finally reached the fleet. The Hellcat didn't whisper like the Zero. It growled. It carried armor that could shrug off rounds that would tear a Zero apart. It packed 6 heavy guns that turned the sky into a storm of lead. And it climbed with a steady, brutal strength that made pilots feel as if the weight of the early war was finally lifting. Harrington felt that difference the moment he touched the controls. Many pilots said that for the first time they believed they might survive instead of merely endure. That belief was powerful. It carried them through training, through long nights on the deck, and into the dawn of June 19th. They were no longer the hunted. They felt the tide shifting, and the men on those carriers sensed that something historic was waiting just beyond the horizon. And they were right, because the first wave was already rising out of the west. And when those blips appeared on radar, the real reckoning finally began. Those radar blips out in the western sky didn't appear by accident. They were the final chapter of a story that had begun long before Harrington strapped himself into his Hellcat that morning. To understand why he faced that day with a quiet confidence, you have to step back for a moment and look at the machine under him, because that machine was not a miracle. It was an answer. It was the result of every hard lesson written in blood from the earliest months of the war. Back in mid-1942, engineers at Grumman sat in cramped rooms with piles of combat notes scattered across their desks. Some of those notes came from men who never came home. Some were the last words a pilot managed to shout before vanishing into smoke. The engineers read every line, and they knew exactly what the Wildcat could not do. It could not outclimb the Zero. It could not turn with it. It could barely keep up in a dive. The men designing the next fighter stopped pretending they could fix these problems. they made a decision that would change the Pacific War. They would build a fighter for survival and power instead of finesse and fantasy. If the Zero was a dancer, the new fighter would be a brawler. It would not rely on delicate maneuvers. It would rely on muscle and toughness. So the engineers sketched out a cockpit built like a steel helmet with armor plates where they mattered most. They wrapped the fuel tanks in layers that sealed themselves when punctured. They carved out space for 6 heavy machine guns that could tear through aluminum skins in one brutal burst. And at the heart of it, they mounted a Pratt & Whitney engine so strong that rookie pilots joked it felt like flying a locomotive with wings. When test pilots first took the prototype into the air, they didn't marvel at its grace. They admired its will. It climbed with a steady, relentless pull. It dove like a stone with teeth. It carried scars from test rounds and kept flying. It was born for a war that punished fragile machines and rewarded anything that could hit hard and come home. By late 1943, this new fighter reached the fleet, and when pilots saw it on the deck, they felt something they had not felt in a long time: hope. Harrington felt that hope the first time he settled into the seat. He remembered how the Wildcat shook when pushed too hard. The Hellcat didn't shake. It waited. It listened through the controls. It invited him to fight without fear that the slightest mistake would send him spiraling into the sea. In training, he watched rookies make errors that would have killed them in earlier planes, yet the Hellcat forgave them. That forgiveness mattered, because by 1944, the war needed numbers as much as it needed veterans. An aircraft that kept rookies alive long enough to learn was worth more than a dozen aces. Behind all of this stood the quiet engine of American industry. While Japan struggled to produce a few hundred fighters a month, American factories poured out thousands. While Japanese cadets scraped by on 50 hours of flight time, American pilots graduated with 300 or more. Harrington knew the war was becoming a contest of systems, not individuals. One nation was running out of fuel planes and experienced men. The other was gaining strength every week. It was only a matter of time before those two trajectories collided, and when they did, the outcome would hinge on machines like the Hellcat and the men who flew them. That collision was approaching fast. Harrington sensed it on the wind as he tightened the straps across his shoulders that June morning. The fleet sensed it too. The calm sea, the still air, the quiet hum across the deck. It all felt like the moment before a hammer strike. And out beyond that horizon where the radar screens kept glowing, something massive was rising into the sky. Because the first Japanese wave was no longer just a blip. It was almost close enough to see. The first wave was forming far out in the west, but to understand how enormous that moment really was, you have to picture the sea on the night before the battle. Every ship in Task Force 58 moved through the dark like part of a giant machine. 15 carriers stretched across miles of open water. Battleships cruised behind them with wakes that glowed faintly under the moon. Heavy cruisers and destroyers patrolled the edges with sharp eyes and sharper radars. It was not a scattered group of ships. It was a wall. And behind that wall waited nearly 1,000 aircraft, most of them Hellcats, ready to launch at a moment's notice. Even the veterans walking the decks that night understood this was not just another strike day. This was the kind of night where men spoke quietly without knowing why. Harrington felt it as he stepped along the planks with the warm wind brushing across his flight suit. He glanced at Ortiz, who carried that mix of nerves and excitement that young pilots always tried to hide. Fuel crews moved between lines of fighters with practiced speed. Ordnance crews hauled boxes of ammunition that clattered softly as the ocean rolled beneath them. The whole deck looked like a heartbeat that refused to slow down. Somewhere to the west, Admiral Ozawa was preparing his own blow. He had 9 carriers left. They carried perhaps 400 aircraft. Many of his pilots were boys with barely 50 hours in the air. A few were veterans, but the rest were young men who had grown up believing the Zero was still invincible. They had no idea how much the war had changed. They had no idea how different the American machine had become. They only knew they were being sent east into a fight their commanders insisted they could still win. On the Independence, Captain Walter Green met with his air group under the dim red lights that always filled the ready rooms at night. Green was a man with a face, etched by long months at Midway and Guadalcanal. His voice carried that low, steady weight that only comes from seeing too many friends fall. He pointed at the tactical board where the lines of expected enemy approach curved inward like claws. He told his men that this was the day the balance would finally break. He told them the Japanese would throw everything they had. He told them Task Force 58 would be the shield that held the line for the entire Pacific campaign. The young pilots listened, and something about the way Green spoke made even the rookies straighten up. By dawn, the ready rooms were empty and the deck roared with life. Harrington slid into his Hellcat again and adjusted his straps. Ortiz climbed into the fighter beside him and gave a quick thumbs up. The handlers moved the aircraft into perfect rows. The sun lifted slowly above the horizon, turning every metal surface into a strip of gold. Then the call came over the loudspeakers that shook the entire deck. Launch! One by one the Hellcats rolled forward. Their engines thundered with the deep growl of raw power waiting to explode. The catapult officers gave crisp signals. Then the fighters shot off the deck, rising into the warm morning air with wings glinting in the sunlight. Harrington felt his stomach press back as the engine pulled him upward. The deck shrank below him until it looked like a child's toy drifting across the sea. When the flight climbed through 10,000 feet, the world changed. The air grew colder. The Pacific spread out like a giant sheet of glass. And in the distance on the radar scopes of every ship in the task force, the first blips thickened into clusters. The men in the combat information centers watched those clusters multiply. Squadrons formed, then formations, then a shape nearly as wide as the horizon. The enemy was coming hard. Mitcher on the Lexington stayed calm as always. His words were firm, his expression unreadable. He ordered the combat air patrol to push farther west. He ordered fresh squadrons to stand by at the elevators. He ordered his radar crews to call every bearing and altitude the second it appeared. He knew that if the Japanese reached his carriers, the price would be enormous. He also knew that the Hellcat was the best chance to stop them long before they ever saw steel. Harrington and Ortiz banked into formation as the radio crackled with voices. Reports from other groups came in fast. Contact at bearing 270. Estimate 80 aircraft climbing. More returns forming behind them. Possibly another wave. Possibly 2. The calm morning had become a powder trail waiting for a spark, and every pilot felt the same thing at the same time. This was it. This was the moment the entire Pacific War had been leaning toward. Because the first shadow of the Japanese formation had just appeared in the haze. And when Harrington saw it, he understood. The real fight was seconds away. The shadow in the haze thickened until it stopped being a shape and became a swarm. Harrington steadied his grip on the stick as the radio crackled with new calls. Fighters diving, bombers climbing, torpedo planes spreading out in long, slow lines. It looked like a dark cloud stretching across the Pacific sky and drifting straight toward the American fleet. Ortiz let out a sharp breath over the radio. His voice had that nervous fire that only young pilots carry. Harrington answered with the calm tone of a man who had seen the worst days of the early war. They both knew what was coming. The Hellcats held the high ground. That was everything. Altitude was life in the Pacific. From above, a fighter could hit with the force of a falling hammer and be gone again before the zero below even twisted its wings. The Japanese formations moved with a kind of beauty that made the moment feel almost quiet. Dozens of silver wings glinting in the sunlight. Crimson circles bright against the morning sky. Dive bombers with big bellies full of explosives. Torpedo planes flying straight and low like men heading into a storm they could not avoid. Somewhere inside those formations were boys barely old enough to shave and veterans who had once ruled the sky. They all flew toward the line of American carriers without ever seeing the blades that were about to cut through them. Dalton's voice came through the radio with that steady weight everyone recognized. His words rolled across the headsets with the same calm he had carried at Guadalcanal. Use altitude, hit once, pull away, never turn with a zero. The men repeated those rules in their heads like a prayer. Harrington pushed the throttle forward. The engine growled and the Hellcat rolled into a steep dive. The air clawed at the canopy. Speed climbed. The world narrowed to a single target rising fast in the center of his gun sight. The first zero never saw him coming. At 400 yards, Harrington tapped the trigger. 6 heavy guns spat fire that shook the entire fighter. Tracers ripped across the sky and walked straight into the Zero's cockpit. The Japanese plane burst into smoke and spiraled downward, trailing flame, as if the morning had opened a hole beneath it. Harrington pulled back into a climb, feeling the G-force crush into his chest. He steadied his breathing. His voice came out level. Splash 1. Ortiz dove behind him and lined up on a Judy bomber. The bomber tried to roll away, but the Hellcat was faster and heavier and hungrier. Ortiz fired a single long burst. The bomber's wing tore free, and the whole aircraft tipped sideways before breaking apart in midair. Ortiz whooped once, then caught himself and returned to formation. It was the kind of excitement only a young pilot could feel in a moment where survival and victory collided. Below them, the sky began to split open. Hellcats poured down from the sun in waves. Some attacked the bomber groups. Some targeted the fighters that tried to regroup. Some circled high, ready to dive again as soon as the next opening appeared. The Japanese pilots fought back with whatever they could muster. A few managed to twist their Zeros into tight turns and snap off shots at the blue fighters that flashed past them, but they were outnumbered, outclimbed, and outgunned. And the coordination that once made the Zero so deadly was gone. Too many green pilots, too little training, too much chaos. A Val tried to break for the clouds and Harrington spotted it immediately. He rolled left, dropped in behind it, and squeezed the trigger. Fire burst along the bomber's fuselage. Its bomb fell free and tumbled end over end until it vanished into the sea. A heartbeat later, the Val followed it in a long, burning arc. Then a new voice cut through the radio. Ortiz? His tone was tight. Skipper. I picked up 2 zeros on my tail. Harrington searched the sky and saw them curving down toward Ortiz with guns already flashing. Harrington rolled hard into a steep dive. The G-force pressed him into his seat. The wind screamed along the canopy. He dropped in behind the trailing Zero and fired a burst that shattered its engine. The other Zero tried to climb away, but Ortiz pulled up and fired clean through its wings. Both Japanese fighters fell smoking toward the water. Across 30 miles of sky, the battle looked like a storm made of fire. Burning planes tumbled through the scattered clouds. Contrails twisted into spirals where dogfights had exploded. Some bombers tried to push through toward the fleet, but fresh Hellcats rose from below like a wall of blue steel. The moment a bomber escaped one group, another dropped onto it from above. It was relentless and precise and brutal, in a way that only a modern aviation system could produce. By the end of the first wave, fewer than 10 Japanese planes reached the American fleet, and none survived the wall of anti-aircraft fire waiting for them. Harrington barely had time to breathe before the radio lit up again. New contacts, larger formation, bearing 280, more than 100 incoming. Ortiz's voice came back with a half laugh, half groan. "Skipper, tell me that is not real." Harrington checked his gauges, fuel steady, ammunition still decent. He answered with the same tone he used before every hard fight. "It is real, and we are going back in." That was when the sky to the west darkened again. Wave 2 was closing fier. Wave 2 came in heavier, faster, and far more desperate than the first. Harrington and Ortiz climbed hard into position with the sun behind them so their silhouettes vanished into the glare. Below them, the second Japanese wave stretched wide across the Pacific, like a dark stain pushed by the wind. Dive bombers in tight clusters. Torpedo planes crawling forward with wings shaking. Zeros scattered across the formation trying to hold some kind of order. This time there was no grace in how they moved. It looked rushed. It looked thin. It looked like a force held together only by sheer determination. Dalton's voice rose again, steady as an anchor. Same rules? Boom and zoom. No turning fights. Keep altitude. Hit hard and climb. The men answered with quick clicks of their radios. No wasted breaths. No wasted words. Harrington pushed his throttle forward and felt the engine surge as the Hellcat tipped its nose into another dive. The wind hammered the canopy. The sky blurred. Then the Japanese formation rose sharply into view, and the world snapped back into focus. He chose a vow. Big belly full of bombs. Slow and vulnerable. Perfect target. Harrington lined up the shot and fired a tight burst. The rounds punched through the fuselage and the bomber lit up in an orange flash. The bomb detonated mid-air, sending shrapnel spinning downward like hot metal rain. Harrington pulled away and climbed back toward the sun. Ortiz swung in from the right and tore through a Judy with a single clean burst. The bomber rolled onto its back and fell in a long, smoking arc. Ortiz's voice hit the radio with a mix of adrenaline and disbelief. "I do not know how many of them there are, but they are coming apart." Harrington answered with a short breath. "Keep working. They will push through if we do not." Zeros suddenly dropped from above, trying to force turning fights. One latched onto Harrington's tail with guns already flashing. Rounds hit his right wing. The Hellcat shuddered hard. Harrington rolled into a steep dive, letting gravity drag him down the column of air. The Zero followed too close, too eager. At 5,000 feet, Harrington pulled into a sharp climbing turn. The big engine roared. The Zero tried to follow, but stalled half a second too long. Harrington flipped the Hellcat inverted and came down behind him like a falling anvil. One burst ended the chase. The Zero broke apart and dropped into the sea with smoke trailing behind it. All across the sky, the same pattern repeated again and again. The Japanese attackers tried to form a spear point toward the fleet, but every time a spear formed, the Hellcats smashed it. Veterans and Zeros tried to rally the younger pilots, but the formations kept losing shape. Dive bombers drifted too far from their escorts. Torpedo planes slipped out of position, and every small opening became a target for another group of American fighters waiting above. Captain Green's squadron slammed into the torpedo planes that had managed to slip under the higher fighting. The Nakajimas crawled forward barely over 200 miles an hour. Against Wildcats in 1942, they had been deadly. Against Hellcats in 1944, they were slow, helpless shadows. Green destroyed 2 in seconds. Others followed. The air filled with trails of fire as aircraft fell into the waves and vanished in splashes that disappeared almost instantly into the churning sea. By late morning, the second wave was broken. The third wave appeared on radar not long after. Not elite pilots now. Mostly boys with barely any training. Some flying aircraft so worn their engines left thin smoke trails even before the fighting began. Still they came. Honor and duty pushed them forward even as they watched the sky fill with burning metal from the waves before them. Harrington and Ortiz climbed again. New Hellcats replaced those low on fuel. The rotation felt endless, like a conveyor belt of blue wings rising straight into a storm. Harrington dove onto a Judy and ripped through its engine. The pilot bailed out with a small white parachute that drifted helplessly toward an ocean already littered with wreckage. Ortiz destroyed another Zero with a single, hard burst. The radio filled with voices. Splash 1, got a Val. Another Judy going down. The sky looked like it was tearing itself apart. Then the fourth wave appeared. Smaller, weaker. Training planes and obsolete aircraft dragged into a hopeless attack. They barely reached the Americans before the Hellcats shredded them. It was the end of Japanese carrier aviation played out in minutes. And when the final burning shape fell into the sea, Harrington steadied his breathing and looked across a sky suddenly empty of enemies. The silence felt unnatural. The battle was ending. But the weight of what had happened was only beginning to settle. Because now came the moment every pilot both feared and prayed for. The moment they had to go home and count who was still alive. When the sky finally emptied, Harrington eased his Hellcat into a slow turn and let the engine settle into a deep, steady hum. The Pacific below him looked nothing like the sea he had flown over that morning. Oil slicks spread across the waves like bruises on the water. Small lifeboats bobbed in uneven circles. Thin black columns of smoke twisted upward from the wrecks of aircraft that had hit the surface only minutes earlier. The battle was over, but the weight of it lingered in the air like a breath no one wanted to release. Ortiz formed up beside him in silence. The young pilot's voice finally cracked through the radio with a quiet edge. Skipper. I do not know how many went down today. Harrington watched a few parachutes drifting toward the waves in the distance. Some belonged to Americans. Some to boys who had flown from Japanese decks with more hope than training. He answered softly. Too many. Then he throttled back and pointed the nose toward the fleet. The carriers rose out of the haze like steel islands. Harrington felt a tremor run through the deck as he caught the arresting wire and jolted to a stop. For a moment, he sat still with his hands on the controls, alive, exhausted, shaken. When he climbed out, sailors were already swarming the aircraft, checking fuel lines, inspecting holes in the wings, reloading ammunition in case the day was not finished with them yet. Across the deck, pilots walked with that strange, wide-eyed look men carry after surviving something bigger than themselves. Some grinned. Some looked lost. Some held their helmets under their arms and stared out at the empty horizon. Ortiz jogged up beside Harrington with sweat streaking down his neck and didn't say a word. He just nodded. That was all that needed to be said. That night in the mess, the ship hummed with the low rumble of engines pushing the task force west. The men crowded around tables, swapping stories with voices still shaking from adrenaline. They reenacted dives with their hands. They traced arcs in the air to show how close they had come to being hit. Yet underneath all that noise was something quieter. A kind of stunned disbelief that they were still here. Captain Green entered with his flight log under his arm. The room softened. He waited for silence, then spoke in a tone that carried the weight of every friend he had buried since 1942. "Gentlemen," he said today, "we didn't weaken Japanese carrier aviation. We destroyed it. 400 aircraft, nearly all gone, and we lost less than 30. No one moved. For a moment, those numbers hung in the air like something too large to grasp. Harrington thought about Pearl Harbor, about the hopeless turns in the Wildcat, about friends lost before they even had a chance to fight back. And now, here they stood on a carrier that felt untouchable. He stepped out onto the open deck later that night when the sky turned dark and the wind cooled the metal. Fires still flickered far out on the water. Somewhere beyond that darkness, a few Japanese survivors floated alone in the vast Pacific. Harrington rested his hands on the railing and understood what this day really meant. Japan had lost more than planes. It had lost the veteran air crews that once carried its empire across the ocean. No system could replace them. No factory could rebuild decades of skill overnight. And the war had stepped fully into a new age where survival belonged not to the boldest pilot, but to the nation that could outbuild, outtrain, and outlast every blow thrown at it. That lesson still feels heavy even now. If you have lived through the Cold War or worn a uniform in your younger years, I would love to know how this idea of systems deciding wars sits with you. Does it make you feel safer? Or does it make you uneasy about where modern conflict is heading? And if you grew up hearing stories from parents or grandparents who served in World War II, did any of them ever talk about the moment they realized the tide had finally turned in the Pacific? If you felt something in this story tonight, I would be grateful if you hit the like button because it helps more than you might think. And if you enjoy hearing these voices from the past, I would be honored if you subscribed so we can keep walking through history together. Wherever you are listening from, I hope you take care of yourself because you and we are not 20 anymore. But as long as you are here, these stories will keep living. Below the quiet deck, the carrier steadied its course toward the next island. Above it, the Hellcats rested, with their wings folded like guardians waiting for dawn. And in the soft darkness of the Pacific night, the meaning of the day settled into place. The Zero had ruled the early war, but the age of the Zero was over. The sky now belonged to the Hellcat.